stories of the past often echo into the present, carrying with them lessons that speak to every land, every culture, every heart. Among the many voices woven through the pages of Scripture, one rises from the margins, from the wilderness, from the tears of a servant woman. It is the story of Hagar, an Egyptian maid whose life became bound to the promise given to Abraham, and whose struggles reveal the God who sees the unseen. This is not merely the account of a servant, it is the cry of a woman caught between power, promise, and pain. To understand her journey is to witness the compassion of God toward those the world overlooks. Welcome back. Please subscribe, like, and share. This means a lot to us. Hagar was an Egyptian, likely brought into their service during Abraham's sojourn in Egypt. For Hagar, life was shaped by servitude, her days filled with labor, her choices not her own. She lived under the shadow of her mistress Sarah, serving faithfully but without expectation of recognition. In the structure of that ancient world, she was one of many invisible ones, present, necessary, but rarely acknowledged. Sarah herself was not without her own burden. Though married to Abraham, a man chosen by God and blessed with divine promises, she bore no children. In that culture, barrenness was more than private grief, it was public shame. Every year that passed without a child deepened her sorrow and stirred questions about her worth. God had told Abraham he would be the father of many nations, yet Sarah's empty womb stood as an obstacle. The ache of disappointment grew heavier with time, until desperation drove her to a decision that would change everything. Turning to Abraham, Sarah made a proposal rooted in custom. "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go, sleep with my maidservant. Perhaps I can build a family through her." This was not unusual in the ancient world. A servant woman could be given as a surrogate, and any child born would legally belong to the wife. To Sarah, it seemed a practical solution, a way to claim the promise through human effort. To Abraham, who had waited long for fulfillment, it was a path he did not resist. And so, Hagar was given. She had no voice in the matter, no power to refuse. Her body became the vessel for another's hope, her life redirected by choices not her own. Yet soon her womb quickened with life, and the servant who had once lived in quiet obedience now bore the first child of Abraham. With pregnancy came a shift. For the first time, Hagar carried something Sarah could not. Within her was the heir of Abraham, and with each passing day, her sense of significance grew. Pride began to stir within her, and the servant who had once bowed her head now looked upon her mistress with lifted eyes. Scripture tells us she began to despise Sarah, and though her pride may have been subtle, a glance, a tone, a smirk, it pierced deeply into Sarah's already wounded heart. The tension between them could not remain hidden. Sarah, once in control of the arrangement, now felt humiliated. The very plan she had devised became her torment. With bitter frustration, she turned to Abraham. "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my servant in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." Her words revealed both anger and sorrow, the sting of betrayal mingled with the ache of inadequacy. Abraham, caught between his wife and the mother of his unborn child, chose distance. "Your servant is in your hands," he said. "Do with her whatever you think best." With those words, he stepped aside, leaving Sarah free to act. Sarah's response was harsh. The mistreatment she dealt to Hagar is not described in detail, but it was enough to break the young servant's spirit. Whether through relentless demands, sharp words, or cruel neglect, Sarah pressed down on Hagar until she could bear it no longer. Though she was carrying Abraham's child, Hagar chose to flee. Pregnant and vulnerable, she ran into the wilderness. This decision was bold, even desperate. The wilderness was no safe refuge, it was barren, dangerous, and unforgiving. Yet the oppression she faced in Abraham's tents had driven her to risk everything. To remain meant continued suffering, to run meant uncertainty and possible death. Between those choices, she chose the wilderness. Hagar's flight reveals much about her condition. She was an outsider, an Egyptian in a Hebrew household, a servant with no rights, a woman whose body was used to solve another's problem. Yet in running, she displayed courage. She would not remain under cruelty, even if escape led her into desolation. In her, we see the voice of countless others throughout history who, when faced with unbearable mistreatment, choose the uncertainty of exile over the pain of bondage. As Hagar wandered, the wilderness became a mirror of her inner state, empty, dry, and full of danger. She carried life within her, yet she herself felt surrounded by death. Alone, exhausted, and pregnant, she embodied human vulnerability at its sharpest point. The servant had become a fugitive, the vessel of promise now adrift with no place to call home. Hagar's footsteps pressed into the wilderness sands, each one heavier than the last. She had fled Sarah's mistreatment, carrying not only her own fragile life but also the unborn child growing within her. The wilderness was vast, unyielding, and indifferent to her pain. The sun beat down upon her back, and her water skin grew lighter with every sip. Behind her lay the tents of Abraham, a place of conflict and cruelty. Before her stretched emptiness, silence, and uncertainty. Yet between two impossible paths, Hagar had chosen the one that at least gave her the chance to breathe free, even if freedom felt perilous. The wilderness was no safe haven. It was a land where survival was uncertain, where travelers could perish from thirst, heat, or wild beasts. Hagar knew this well, yet she pressed on. Her choice to flee revealed the depth of her suffering. Better to face death in the desert than endure life under Sarah's harsh hand. Still, as the miles wore on and her strength drained, fear began to overtake her. The scriptures do not give us every detail of those hours, but we can imagine the torment within her. Alone, with no companion, no guiding direction, she must have questioned whether she had sealed her fate and the fate of her child. Her body ached, her heart pounded, and doubt whispered cruelly in her ears. What hope do you have here, Hagar? What will become of you? What will become of your son? The silence of the desert has a way of amplifying inner voices. Every memory of Sarah's scorn, every look of Abraham's withdrawal, every reminder that she was but a servant and an outsider, all of it pressed heavily upon her soul. She was Egyptian, foreign among Hebrews. She was a woman, vulnerable in a patriarchal world. She was a servant, treated as property. And now, she was a fugitive with no protection. If ever there was one who could be called unseen, unheard, forgotten, it was Hagar. Her story in this moment reveals the harshness of human conflict. Sarah's desperation had turned to cruelty, Abraham's passivity had left Hagar exposed, and Hagar herself had been carried by pride and then crushed by consequences. The result was a woman wandering alone, her very survival in jeopardy. It is here that we see a timeless truth. Human conflicts often spill over onto the most vulnerable, those who bear the weight of decisions they never made. Hagar's plight also reflects the vulnerability of outsiders in biblical narratives. She did not belong fully to Abraham's household, nor did she belong to any tribe in the wilderness. She was caught between worlds, too Egyptian for one family, too Hebrew for another, and too powerless to create a place of her own. Outsiders, then and now, often find themselves carrying the heaviest burdens. Yet even in the desert, Hagar pressed on. Her survival instincts must have driven her feet to keep moving, searching for water, for shade, for a place where she could rest. Perhaps she remembered rivers from her homeland in Egypt, and the memory drove her forward. Perhaps she whispered to her unborn son, promising him that she would not give up. Even in despair, love can give strength to keep walking. Still, the reality of her condition was dire. Pregnant, exhausted, and nearly without resources, Hagar's situation could easily have ended in tragedy. No family awaited her. No allies stood ready to defend her. No safe refuge opened its doors. She had left the tents of Abraham in haste, with only the determination to escape, but she had no plan for survival. This moment captures the raw fragility of Hagar's life. She was more than a name in history. She was a woman whose body carried exhaustion, whose heart carried fear, and whose spirit teetered between despair and endurance. Anyone who has ever felt abandoned, mistreated, or unseen can find their reflection in her. But the beauty of Hagar's story is that her wilderness wandering was not the end. Though she felt alone, she was not abandoned. Though she felt invisible, she was seen. Though she felt unheard, her cries did not go unnoticed. At the very edge of her endurance, a divine encounter awaited her, one that would not erase her suffering but would transform her understanding of herself and her God. As she moved through the wilderness, perhaps collapsing near a spring of water, her despair reached its peak. Yet at that very place, heaven leaned down to meet her. The God who had called Abraham out of Ur, the God who promised nations, would also reveal himself to this Egyptian servant. The conflict that had driven her into the desert was real and cruel. The flight that had left her wandering was desperate and dangerous. Yet in this moment of near despair, Hagar's story was about to turn. The wilderness, though harsh, was about to become the stage for revelation. Her tears had not been wasted. Her footsteps had not gone unnoticed. Her struggle, though born of human conflict, would be redeemed by divine compassion. The same God who spoke stars into the sky would soon speak into her pain. Her life proclaimed that the Lord of heaven bends low to see and hear those the world overlooks. By a spring in the wilderness, along the road that led to Shur, Hagar found a place to collapse in exhaustion. Her strength was nearly gone, her flask of water nearly empty, and her heart nearly broken. The wilderness pressed against her with unrelenting force, yet at that lonely spring, a moment of divine encounter reshaped her story forever. For it was there, at her lowest, that the angel of the Lord appeared to her. The appearance of the angel was not just a vision to inspire her imagination. Scripture records it as a real encounter, one where heaven reached down into earth's despair. Hagar, an Egyptian servant, marginalized and mistreated, became the first woman in Scripture to receive a direct appearance of the angel of the Lord. This detail alone is striking. God's presence came not first to a king or priest, but to a servant girl on the run. The angel called her by name, Hagar, servant of Sarah, where have you come from, and where are you going? These words pierced her heart. For the first time, someone spoke to her not as an object, not as a womb for another's plan, but as a person. Her identity was acknowledged, her name spoken aloud, her position recognized. This was not an accusation but a gentle confrontation, a question that gave her dignity by inviting her to share her story. Hagar answered honestly, her voice likely trembling from both fear and weariness. I am running away from my mistress Sarah. In those words, her pain was revealed. She had not run to anything, only away. Her life was driven by mistreatment, her direction shaped by escape, her future shrouded in uncertainty. Yet the angel did not leave her in that brokenness. The message given to her was both challenging and filled with promise. The angel said, Go back to your mistress and submit to her. At first, these words might sound harsh. To return to the very place of her suffering seemed unbearable. Yet God's instruction was not about keeping her bound to cruelty, but about anchoring her within His larger plan. The promise He spoke next made this clear. The angel continued, I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count. Hagar, the servant cast aside, was promised a legacy. Her son would not be forgotten, and her lineage would not be erased. The child within her would live, grow, and become the father of a multitude. She had thought she carried only despair, but within her womb was a destiny only God could ordain. The angel went further, You are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility toward all his brothers. The name Ishmael carried profound meaning. God hears. This was not coincidence. God was declaring to Hagar that her cries, her misery, her anguish in the wilderness had reached His ears. Though Sarah may have silenced her, though Abraham may have stepped aside, though the world may have dismissed her, the living God had heard her voice. The prophecy about Ishmael was both sobering and promising. He would grow to be strong, independent, untamed like a wild donkey in the desert. His life would be marked by conflict, yet he would endure, survive, and thrive as a nation. For Hagar, this was both warning and reassurance. Her son would not live a peaceful, easy life, but he would not be erased. He would live, and through him, her name would endure. In response to this extraordinary encounter, Hagar did something remarkable. She gave God a name. Scripture tells us she called him El-ROI, meaning the God who sees me." This was the only time in the Bible where a human gave God a name based on personal experience. For Hagar, the defining truth of that wilderness moment was not just that God hears but that God sees. He saw her affliction, her tears, her vulnerability, her despair, and he came near. Her declaration is profound. "I have now seen the one who sees me." In a world where she was invisible, God had looked upon her. In a life where she was unheard, God had spoken to her. For all who feel overlooked and forgotten, Hagar's testimony resounds across time. God is El-ROI, the God who sees. The spring where this encounter took place was later called Bir Lahai Roy, meaning, the well of the living one who sees me. It became a marker of divine compassion, a sacred reminder that no one is beyond God's gaze. For Hagar, the well was not just a source of water, it was the place where her identity shifted, where despair turned to hope, and where invisibility became testimony. Strengthened by the words of the angel, Hagar rose from her place of exhaustion. She carried within her not only the child Ishmael but also the assurance that her life mattered to God. She returned to Abraham and Sarah's household, not as the same broken servant who had fled, but as one who had met the God who sees. Her return was not easy. Sarah was still her mistress, and Abraham was still her master. But Hagar carried a secret strength within her, the knowledge that she was not forgotten, not abandoned, not unseen. Her submission was not surrender to cruelty, but trust in the God who had spoken promises over her. The sun rose harshly over the desert of Beersheba as Hagar walked with Ishmael beside her. Abraham had placed into her hands a skin of water and some bread. But the provision was small for the journey ahead. Each step carried the weight of loss of home, loss of security, loss of a father's presence for her son. Yet most painful of all was the fresh sting of rejection. Once again, Hagar and Ishmael found themselves outside the circle of belonging, cast into the wilderness where survival itself was uncertain. As the day stretched on and the heat bore down, the water supply dwindled. Hagar's heart sank with each drop poured out. She rationed carefully, but the desert shows no mercy to travelers, and thirst grew unbearable. Ishmael, still a youth but no longer a small child, weakened under the scorching sun. His strength faded, his steps slowed, and finally, he collapsed under the weight of exhaustion. When the skin of water was empty, despair consumed Hagar. The memory of her first flight into the wilderness came rushing back. Then she had carried him within her womb. Now she watched him struggle for breath before her. Her mother's heart could not endure the sight. With trembling hands, she led Ishmael to a nearby bush, shaded though meager, and placed him beneath it. Stepping away, she wept bitterly. "I cannot watch the boy die," she said, lifting her voice in anguish. But heaven had not turned away. Scripture tells us that God heard the boy crying. Ishmael's name, God hears, was once again fulfilled in this desperate moment. The angel of God called to Hagar from heaven, asking, "What is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation." These words pierced through despair like light breaking through clouds. The same God who had met Hagar by the spring years earlier now met her again in the desert. The same God who promised Ishmael's future now reaffirmed it. Where human rejection had spoken finality, divine compassion spoke continuity. Then, God opened Hagar's eyes, and she saw a well of water nearby. In her grief and panic, she had not noticed it before, but the Lord revealed it at the precise moment of need. She hurried to fill the skin and gave Ishmael a drink. The life that seemed to slip away returned as water touched his lips. Strength revived in him, and hope revived in her. The wilderness that threatened death became the place of provision, a testimony of God's sustaining hand. From that day forward, Ishmael grew under the watchful care of God. The scripture records that he lived in the desert and became an archer, a man of resilience shaped by the harshness of the land yet preserved by the promise of God. His life was not one of ease, but it was marked by survival and strength. He eventually settled in the desert of Paran, and Hagar secured for him a wife from Egypt, her homeland, connecting his future to her own roots. Thus, the promises spoken at the spring were fulfilled. Ishmael became the father of a great nation, his descendants too numerous to count. The prophecy that he would live in conflict with others proved true, yet it was not a sign of God's absence but of his enduring independence. Ishmael's line stood as living proof that the God who hears and sees does not forget. Hagar's journey, traced from maidservant in Abraham's household to wanderer in the desert, reveals a story deeper than sorrow. Though rejected by Sarah and displaced from Abraham's home, she was never rejected or displaced from the purposes of God. Twice cast into the wilderness, twice met by God's presence. To the servant in the desert, to the outsider, to the forgotten, he reveals himself as El-ROI. Her story becomes a testimony not only of survival but of divine intimacy. The wilderness that seemed empty became the very place where she was seen most clearly. Hagar returned from the wilderness carrying with her both the promise of God and the weight of obedience. She went back to Sarah and Abraham's household, not because her circumstances had suddenly changed, but because God had met her in the desert and told her to go. That return required courage. To step again into the place of mistreatment was no small act, yet Hagar's steps were steadied by the assurance of El-ROI, the God who sees. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, like and share. See you in our next video.